So it's my pleasure today to be with Professor Mark Isaac, who's the John and Hallie Quinn Eminent Scholar and Professor of Economics at Florida State University, and formerly a intense user of ESL. So Mark, let me start off by asking you, well, thanks for being with me.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm happy to be here. Really enjoying this. So.
That's great. That's great. It's great to have you back. And so let me start off by asking you, when were you here at ESL? During what time period were you conducting research?
Okay, well, I came here in 1980, and ESL as an institution didn't even exist then. It was formed a few years later. Then I left Arizona in 2001. So I was at U of A for 21 years. Most of that time there was an ESL. Okay.
Okay, very good. And so, to put this in perspective, who were the colleagues here doing experiments when you arrived?
Okay, well, there's obviously Vernon.
Yes.
Jim Cox, and Jimmy Walker. As far as faculty, Arlie Williams who was a graduate student, had just graduated and gone to Indiana, and he was instrumental in convincing me to come here, that I would enjoy my time here. Don Corsi was a graduate student here. You see, Corsi is a co-author on several of the papers that Vernon and I did. So I'm trying to. I think from the start, that's kind of the universe of the people that I was working with on experiments, which is a pretty good universe. But that's
a good fraction of the experimentalists in the world at the time.
Yeah.
So you were involved with experimental research, I guess, before you came here already.
Yes.
You've done some work in
Did
graduate school.
a lot of work with Charlie Plott at Caltech. Charlie and I co-authored with other people, that is, including the two of us and other people, 5 papers while I was at Caltech. So I really got interested in experimental economics at Caltech.
Okay, so when you came here to Arizona, you consider yourself an experimentalist already? Or?
I kind of consider myself an experimental I/O public policy person. I mean, I was then and still am intensely interested in the public policy aspects of what experiments can do, which is not everything that people who do experiments are interested in. But I was doing a lot of what might be called I/O work with Roger Knoll, and I kind of saw my career as somehow combining the I/O stuff with the experimental stuff.
So Roger was your advisor?
Roger was technically my advisor, but kind of my co-authoring work was mostly with Charlie, and I thought that was a pretty good combination. And so it turned out to be correct. So
I see. So when you landed here, the whole milieu, there were a lot of experiments going on, and that sort of got you. You just continued where you left off.
Yeah, I mean, so when I got here. So what experiments are going on? The ones that I know were going on were, this will come up in my talk about Jim Cox tomorrow.
Okay.
I think that Vernon and Jim were through the Smith, Williams, Bratton, and Vanoni phase, and were in the Cox, Robertson, Smith phase of the auction experiments, and maybe just getting involved in the Cox, Smith, and Walker stuff. So
to clarify for the audience,
that's
they were
auction.
done doing kind of posted offer markets,
Posted,
auction markets,
one-sided auctions, Dutch auctions, seal bid auctions versus open outcry auctions, that kind of stuff. So that was something that they were really interested in. And I had just completed the experiments and was writing up a paper that had been presented at conferences on public goods with Charlie and Ken McHugh. And so I ended up in a quote office across the hall from Jimmy. Jimmy and I were junior faculty who were both in basically broom closets with no windows and stuff like that at that time over in the old economics buildings, and we were across the hall from each other. And there was a student in one of the undergraduate classes, and I somehow connected with Arlie, somehow connected with Vernon, somehow connected with Jimmy. I'm not sure about the networking there, but she had as a project computerized an early simple computerized public goods experiment. Modeled actually after the form that Marwell and Ames, who were political sociologists, had done, not the way that Charlie and I had done. Okay, there's some technical details in how they work. So, but she graduated, so there was this kind of 25% shell built of a public goods thing, and Jimmy knew about this. And he said, you know, we got this shell, you've never done computerized experiments, we've never extended this to public goods, and we got to talking. And so, as I remember what our motivation was, you'd had this broad literature, either outside of economics, like political sociologists, psychologists, in some cases, Peter Bohm was an economist, but he did non-standard field experiments,
Yes.
okay, who had produced this literature that the free riding thing was just kind of a fiction of economists' imagination, all right? Vernon was working on some public goods experiments, but he was from a very mechanism design-oriented stuff. He wasn't looking as much at the standard voluntary contributions process type things that these guys were working with. And then totally simultaneously and unbeknownst to each other, Charlie and Ken McHugh and I at Caltech and Mark Walker and Oliver Kim at Stony Brook said about this previous literature, wait a minute, okay, hang on just a second, okay. And almost identical openings of our papers and motivations were twofold, that the prior literature did not have control of the relationship between the decisions and a theory that even would predict free riding, okay? And for some of those that it did, they weren't done very well. You know, they didn't pay people and so on and so forth. I actually use Mark and Oliver's paper in my class because I think the introduction and the dissection of those things is better done in Oliver's paper than it is in our paper. So I use that. He has all these things. But the end result with that was that Charlie and Ken and I came up and said, no, we get like tons of free riding. And Mark Walker was like, no, I get tons of free riding. So
It was in your 1985 paper.
yeah, but we you know, that was first being presented at conferences even before I came here. Okay, so Jimmy and I were talking, and what we were thinking was that it was kind of a bad place for this research to be in, where people could say, well, economists run experiments and they get free riding, and non-economists run experiments and they don't get free riding. Now, some of this could be due to the fact that we were using kind of the Smith plot environment of a well-run economics experiment, and a lot of these other guys weren't, but there are also these issues about, well, maybe they weren't really testing the theory correctly. So I think our goal was with utilizing this computerized experiment, we could get a lot of control, we could run the experiments in the right way, but there might still be features of the experiments that were different between what people had previously run and what the economists had run. That wasn't because they were economists, but because there were aspects of the environment that was causing this to be the case. And we thought it would be actually a service to show that you didn't have to get into this economist versus non-economist mode to do this. And so what we set out to do was to say, what kinds of things could we list out that might push contributions up or push it down? And kind of the rest of this is history, because we looked at group size and came up with the MPCR effect and all this kind of stuff. So, you know, that started a multi-year, multi-paper collaboration between me and Jimmy on public goods.
So if I recall correctly, your initial work with McHugh and Plott had a kind of a nonlinear production function for the public goods, and then in your later work with Jimmy, you had a linear.
Well, no, we had a linear marginal cost. We had downward sloping demand curves. So
I see.
that the more you gave, the lower the MPCR. What we would now say is the more you gave, the lower the MPCR was. So the further you went on the contribution level, what Jimmy and I would call the MPCR was just going like way down. Okay, and so you can easily explain the Isaac McHugh and Plott papers by having a really low MPCR, and similar. Mark Walker and Oliver Kim had a more complex production function with different costs. I think he had a step function or something like that. But nevertheless, you look back on that, and he had what we call MPCR less than 1 over the whole range, and so it wasn't surprising that he got a lot of free riding. And it wasn't that these other papers you could point to and say, aha, they didn't, but in many of these papers, the MPCR was either unknown or uncontrolled.
I see.
So there are experiments in which people were bicycling, and they're all connected to a light, and the brighter the light, the higher the grade you got in class. Well, what if people like bicycling, right? Bring people in a room and said, you want to bike? A lot of people will bike for a while just because they like it. Even Marwell and Ames, which is closest, in some of their original work, they had multiple step function payoffs, and we know that the step functions behave differently than linear. So I think that what Jimmy and I were able to say is, and I still tell my classes that, you got to hand it to these other guys, is they were the first people to take the economist assertion that was in a lot of the textbooks seriously of free riding as a problem into challenging.
Yes. And
they didn't always do it well. And Jimmy and I could kind of find out a little bit of what was going on, but we could kind of say, yeah, here's, as we ultimately did this, here's an environment that is run by experimental economists using the standard conditions and where the standard theory predicts zero contributions, and you don't get zero contributions, which is what these other guys were doing. So we were able to say, no, it's not just that they're not economists. They may not have run the world's best experiments, but they were really onto something in some way. So kudos to those guys for raising the questions.
And so you hypothesized before doing your work with Jimmy that MPCR would be a key determinant of
No.
You didn't hypothesize that.
No. We hypothesized from the literature of like Buchanan and Olson that group size would probably be it. We hypothesized from just the critique, some of the critiques of the previous work, that they didn't do a lot of repetition, and so we thought that repetition knowledge would play a role. Those were a couple of our first things. We actually did. We've never done anything with the data. We did do a voting process which mimicked Vernon Smith's stuff, but the MPCR effect came out in the following way. So we had run 4-person groups with 0.75 MPCRs and got fairly high contributions. And so we're saying, okay, well, Buchanan or Olson would say that our group isn't large enough. So you take this payoff function. The way we explained it to people was you all get an equal share, 1/4 times, and then we had a productivity constant that made the public good valuable. 1/4 times 3 times the sum of everybody's contributions. That was it. And the Pareto optimum was everybody contributing, and Nash was nobody contributing, and so forth. And we got fairly significant cooperation, fairly significant levels of public good. And we were thinking, well, okay, 4 is small, so let's do it to 10. So okay, what we do 10 is we just increase 10. All right, so we're gonna run the next period, and just instructions are gonna look the same, and it's gonna be 10. And Jimmy's looking at this, and he said, I'm kind of worried that by raising this up to 10, we're changing something inside here. We're changing the things at the margin. We're changing total payoffs. And I said, and I remember saying, it being a meeting that we were running out of time. I said, you're onto something. Let's all think about this, okay? And the next time we came back, I said, no, I think the problem is, and I had kind of worked it out. I said, there's no way to make like only one of these changes. Something has to, if this thing changes, you can't keep all these other 3 things constant. One of these things has to pop out. And so we were mapping it on the board, and I said, one of these things that can't be kept constant is what you're talking about, which is this penalty at the margin. So I still remember we drew this like 2x2 box up on Jimmy's board, and we said, okay, 4 people and 10 people in our original thing, and then you changed it. If you just scratched out 4 and changed it to 10, you change this penalty function from 0.25 to 0.7, i.e. 0.75 to 0.3 MPCR. And so we put that at the opposite box, and we came up with what ways we would have to control these functions to get 4 people in the low end, and we called this thing at the top the MPCR 0.3 and 0.75. I still can remember that diagram being on Jimmy's blackboard, and that's where that came from. We kind of in that very early paper with Susan Thomas's papers, we pushed it a little bit, and then we thought there was enough there that we got the grant and did the 86 paper that was focused exclusively on the MPCR and the group size.
So probably couldn't imagine that would be the standard way that people study self versus group interested behavior in the social sciences.
No. I think we were amazed at how that whole concept took over, and Jimmy and I are still Jimmy's and some co-authors were doing papers that related to Gechter and Weiss. I mean, mispronouncing that, in Europe, and one of my students got in on this. They're still we're doing, like, does MPCR matter for absolutely one-shot games with no repetition, no tomorrow? Yeah. You bring people in, they don't know each other. There's no tomorrow. What do they do if it's a one-shot thing? So we're, decades later, we're still interested in the effects of MPCR.
So did you, on this one more question on this
Sure.
topic, did you hypothesize before your work with Jimmy that cooperation would decline over time?
Yeah.
You thought that would happen?
Yep. Just because of what I had seen with Ken and Charlie. It dropped dramatically in the experiments we did with Charlie. Yep.
Let's move on to some other work you did here at ESL. Can you tell us about some other work you're involved with? You were here for a long time. You've done a lot of projects here.
So there was kind of a period where a group of us did different types of I/O experiments. Vernon and Don Corsi and I did work on contestability, which is a hot theory in I/O at the time. And we were able to do a kind of proof of concept study in the lab that showed that contestability had the power, that in a world in which contestability ought to have power, it did have power. And then Vernon and I did a paper on working from the kind of work that was coming out of what might be called old Harvard I/O, that is generating something called predatory pricing from the shape of cost curves, that we were having an incredibly difficult time coming up with proof of concept showing that you could get predatory pricing in the laboratory. Now, the mindset has changed in I/O where the idea of now if you go to the Justice Department, FTC, and you ask them what causes predatory pricing, they don't go back to the old Harvard textbooks and pull out cost curves and make stories about deep pockets, and this person has this deeper, they all go to the Gang of Four stuff and the reputation stuff. That stuff was just coming into the literature and had not yet influenced, I think, most policy I/O by the time when we were doing this. And the idea was, well, you need a big firm and a little firm, but this firm has to have deeper pockets and all this kind of stories that people would tell. And so Vernon and I are like, okay, if this is a phenomenon, we ought to be able to come up with a design that gets it. And we tried like 5 different designs, and we could never come up with that. So that was kind of a cool paper. And then I mean, my goodness, Jim Cox and I did some stuff on both procurement auctions and incentive compatible regulatory auctions, kind of extension of my interest in I/O. And then I got involved with Duncan James on first some risk, and then we did a Vickrey combinatorial auction paper, and then we did our a paper that was really motivated by Duncan, which is what happens in an asset market when you have tournament incentives for the players, which was meant to represent the kind of urban legend that traders in the stock market had tournament incentives, although those contracts are not generally common knowledge. A group of empirical finance people, Brown, Harlow, and Starks, had done an empirical paper that said it sure looks like the way this stuff is moving suggests that these people have some kind of sensitivity to a tournament effect. So we found that tournament incentives did matter. If you remember Smithsonian and Williams' early work, that if you brought back people 3 times, that they would start trading down fundamental values. So what Duncan and I did is we had this crazy scheme where we brought people back 6 times. If you can imagine, we had six rounds of the same people. And first 3 were doing standard Smith-Sojonic and Williams and getting them to start trading along the fundamental value. And then we introduced tournament incentives, and they started rebubbling. So that was very cool. And then another kind of funny thing that came out of a collaboration with Duncan was he was doing another project, and I don't know whatever happened to it. I know they worked on it. I'm not sure that they ever got it published, but it was a finance experiment. Okay, and Duncan was had a minor in finance and or whatever the word is, co-degree or master's in finance. Anyway, he was in economics and in finance in some way, and so he was working on a paper with a faculty member in finance, and he came to me and said, "Well, we want to control for risk preferences. How do we do that?" Now think back to the time this was. This is before Holt and Lowry, long before Holt and Lowry.
This is in the 1990s.
This is the 1990s. I said, well, that's kind of a complicated question, because I said there's one group of people, largely here at Arizona, who argue that you can back out risk preferences from first price auctions. And there are another group of people at other places who said they don't believe that. And somebody just published a paper with the second price incentive process and BDM, and they get very different results, and they're saying, look, the first price auction stuff is misleading, it's not risk aversion. And I said, it kind of puts you in a bind, because regardless of what you do, half the people who know this are going to kind of get after you. He said, what do you think I ought to do? I said, well, why don't we set something up where you do both? I'll help you. And then I said, obviously, even though they're getting different numbers, you ought to be able to take the set of people who score risk-loving in both and say these are relatively risk-loving people, and take the people who are risk-averse in both and call them the risk-averse people, and then say that it's robust to either of the 2 ways of doing it, then people will be satisfied with what we're doing. So we set that stuff up, and that became the Who Are You Calling Risk-Averse paper, where it showed that not only were these things were essentially uncorrelated, in fact, they were negatively correlated. Wow. The people who were showing up as risk averse in the first price auctions were showing up as risk loving in the BDM and the other place. But the big difference was that there were a set of people who were risk neutral in both institutions versus those who were very unstable, and that led to a paper that was completely separate from their later work, just on the fact that we showed that people's apparent risk preferences could be a whole lot more complex than people thought. So that was one of that, and the stuff I was doing with Duncan was kind of the last stuff I was doing here before I left for FSU. So
I see. So maybe you can give us a feel for the technology you used for running experiments.
Well, everything I did at Caltech was hand-run. Everything.
At Caltech's hand-run.
Yeah.
And when you came here, then
that was the whole conversation with Jimmy, as he had this student who was a class project who had used the Plato system, which Arlie Williams had discovered could be. This was a language learning and physics learning system that was being sold to U of A for, have your large sections go to the lab and do these lessons. And Arlie, and I just heard today from John Drabicki, there was actually another student in the department who went to Arlie who kind of saw that this coding could be manipulated to run instead of sending back and forth messages about right and wrong answers to physics or language questions, it could be sent back and forth to be bids and offers. And so that had got that that was Arley's big thing. Arley created the computerized asset markets, and I think it was.
So that was already that was
That
sort
was
of in place.
that was in
after you got
place.
here
So
in the
in
1980s.
place, and so one of the students was using Plato as a term project to do this version of public goods. And so from the very beginning, Jimmy's deal was, well, we have this kind of shell that doesn't work very well, but could be fixed up of a public good. But the problem was Susan Thomas was an undergraduate, so she had graduated, and I don't think she stayed in academia. She was just off in a job. So we had. She did the original version, but it needed a lot of work. She's the co-author on the first paper. So
And you're referring to the computerized public goods.
computerized public goods. So from the very beginning, Jimmy and I were interested in seeing whether we could make Susan Thomas's shell work as a computerized public goods. But even the a lot of the I/O stuff was paper supplemented to a computerized auction. So a lot of the bells and whistles we had to put on for some of this stuff often involved extensive handwritten instructions compared to what were on there. So they were kind of mixed computerized hand-run experiments. And even the risk one I mentioned, we were the first price auctions, we used one of the first price auction programs here, but we ran the BDM auctions by hand. So even the 1990s, there was and we ran the Vic recombinatorial auctions by hand.
That must
so
have been quite.
That was
that's pretty strenuous.
yeah, that was very strenuous. So there was still a mix of using computers and hand run. And I ran a couple of series of hand-run experiments at Florida State after I got here with a graduate student at Arizona, like right at the cusp of where I was leaving. And that's kind of the last hand-run experiments that I've run.
So how did you indicated you moved to Florida State in, I think, 2001?
Right.
So how did your time here at ESL influence your career afterwards? So,
well, I mean, it basically cemented the idea that experiments were going to be a living, technology, that they weren't going to go away. And so I was able to, feel like I could have a productive career doing what I had fun doing, even another institution. And we had access to Plato to watch and get data at Florida State, but we couldn't run. We did have computers, and Tim Salmon, who was there when I was there, was able to do some simple programming to do some auction experiments. And then we hired another graduate student named Artie Zalante, who's now a dean at UNCC, to really kind of step in and do programming to get the stuff we were interested in at Florida State up there.
That was the Plato system.
No, that was with these freestanding computers. It was probably done in next generation. Yeah, our access at that point, our access to Plato was simply for me to be able to watch if I was running something with Jimmy or something like that, to watch the things. We had no experimental capacity of Plato, and it was just a year or two in there that Plato became Novanet, which got sold and sold and sold, and it was essentially killed. Yeah, and so in fact, that's why I quickly downloaded tons of data and put it on my web page, because I could be lost forever. Yeah.
So you mentioned that by the time you moved to Florida State, you were convinced experimental economics was here to stay.
Yeah.
It was a well-established methodology. When in the early days, did you have a feeling that you were basically part of something big that was going to be a new field, that was going to be
kind of. I mean, I felt like
origin of a whole new revenue stream.
Yeah, but the most important thing, it was fun. But so I mean, I'm not sure we knew whether or not it was going to 10 years out if it was just going to be stomped back down. But it certainly was. It certainly was taking off. I mean, to be able to come to Arizona and immediately have a working group that was Vernon and Jim Cox and Jimmy Walker and so forth, and then have the Caltech lab, and so all of a sudden you kind of had, and then had Ray and John at Texas A&M, and then Charlie Holt was starting up at Virginia, and I may be missing some people, but
Caltech group.
yeah, Betsy would have been doing experiments, continuing on her work, probably in the Coase theorem at her early jobs, which were Wyoming, I think. Is that right? Or you'd have to ask Betsy, but kind of. So all of a sudden you kind of had, and actually Don Corsi ended up with Betsy at Wyoming for at least a while. They overlapped. I don't remember all the paths, but all of a sudden you had several regional centers just in the United States. You had Virginia, you had Texas A&M, you had Arizona, you had Caltech, you had Wyoming, and so it was clear that the number of places that were doing this was going up and not going down, and that was fun.
So, can you tell us something, kind of a story that's funny or interesting about something that happened here at ESL in the years you were here?
Well, okay, two things. One thing that doesn't involve ESL, but kind of one of the funniest things that happened in the department was there was a Halloween party where we all dressed up as stuff, and I'm not sure that we could get away with doing this. We'd probably all be reported to some board of sensitive people or something like that at the time. But there's some great pictures of me and Jimmy Walker and other people there at that time. That wasn't specifically.
What were you dressed up as?
I was profit maximization, so I was just this guy in this robe, with a stick or something like that. And Jimmy was south of the bordered Hessian and all these funny terms from economics. So, what I think this isn't. I don't think this is funny, like ha funny, but I think it's funny, interesting, which is that Vernon played a very different role in the development of ESL than he did in terms of ESA. And so I think it's interesting, is that ESL, here's how I remember ESL being delivered. We were looking for a permanent department chair. Dave Pingree was acting. We were looking for a permanent. I remember the person's name, but I'm not going to mention it because I don't want to bring stuff that's irrelevant in the conversation. But there was a guy from another university who was kind of a finalist, and he kind of came out for a first visit. It kind of went okay, and the dean kind of liked him. He came out for a second visit, and he kind of upped his demands to a big commitment to the type of stuff he did, which nobody else at Arizona was doing. And I guess that was kind of a deal breaker. Anyway, it never happened. Okay, so that didn't work. But Dave Pingree, it took me to lunch over at the student union. He said, yeah, talking to Ken Smith as this was going on, I was like, why are you even considering a process of throwing all this money at a new person to develop an area where he's going to be the only person here? Hiring around a person like that takes forever. It's risky because you can't just go get 2 junior people. You've got to do all this stuff. You don't. And he said, you've already got 4 experimental economists here remaking the world. Why aren't we doing that for the experimental group? And he said, what do you think about that? I thought, sounds good to me. And he was aware of this thing called decision packages that the state legislature did. And he said, this is a natural for a decision package because you guys are already here. And it's not like you're throwing a bunch of money at something that's speculative. You're throwing money at something that has a proven track record. So I remember Dave and I and I don't remember I don't think Jim Cox was there, but I can't swear that he wasn't. I definitely remember Dave Pingree was there, and I was there talking to Vernon. And Vernon was actually very skeptical about ESL. One reason that I remember and could appreciate was that in the late 50s and early 60s, there had been a flurry of work in experimental decision making among psychologists like Foraker and Siegel, and Sidney Siegel passed away, but that was kind of a big thing that lost a lot when Sidney Siegel died. But there were several groups that started doing that, and they ended up with rooms full of computers that just had blankets over them because nobody was using them. So Vernon was aware of that you know, it was a lot easier to say we're going to do a lab structure than to get it done. The second stuff was kind of, as an assistant professor, was kind of over my head, but it had to do with dynamics of centers and so forth at Purdue. You know, Vernon had come from Purdue, had seen Purdue fall apart, and so there were some concerns that Vernon had, and Dave Pingree kind of laid out how many resources could flow in if you got one of these decision packages, and essentially brought Vernon around to agreeing to support the ESL decision package, which, I mean, if I remember right, Dave Pingree pretty much outlined the first version of it himself and kind of showed it to Vernon.
So you'd credit Dave Pingree with sort of being the
Of course, of ESL. And then we were right in the middle of this, and we hired Ed Zajac. So because he was the new department chair, we contacted him and say, you know, this is going forward to be a decision package. Do you have any objection to this? He said no, and so actually Ed Zajac came right when it was kind of, you know, he put his name behind it, and it went to the legislature. And you know, by that time Vernon was really enthusiastic about it, all right, and really kind of took the bull by the horns after it was organized. ESA is very different in that Vernon was without a doubt the driving force behind wanting to organize ESA. And a lot of people will use ESL and ESA interchangeably, and they're not. And Vernon, I can remember Vernon had done a couple of conferences before 1980 that had kind of gone into remission, and we did a couple more.
Those are the Tucson experimental workshops.
Yeah, were Tucson experimental workshops, and we had a couple more here after a pause. And between the first and the second of those, of the renewed ones, Vernon was coming to people and saying, I think I'm going to propose at lunch on what was the second one, that we seriously think about forming an association. And so that, Vernon, without a doubt, was the driving force behind the organization of ESA.
So in your recollection, was ESA supposed to be a society built around ESL? Was there supposed to be a close connection between
It was just kind of,
or the independent?
just kind of as just like, it was a coincidence in the name.
Okay,
Yeah.
I see.
Vernon I'm not, you know, you need to interview Vernon because I don't want to speak to him, but as I remember him, his vision was that laboratory methods was just a piece of getting economists to think rigorously about the interactions of theory and data. So it is no longer the case, but originally ESA was organized around intellectual sections. There was a theory section, there was an experimental section, there was an economics and psychology section, there was an experimental law and economics section. That was 100% Vernon's idea. And there's an econometrics method session, okay. And so Vernon was quite big tent in the idea that this was not just supposed to be, whereas our lab was an experimental economics lab, the ESA was not supposed to be just about lab research. Lab research was going to play an important part because it would kind of open people's eyes to what it meant for theory and data to interact in an appropriate way.
I mean, I guess that's kind of, that's suggested by the name Economic Sciences
Association.
Very, very broad.
Right,
rather
right.
than, you know,
Laboratory
Laboratory Experimental
right,
Association
that's
or
right.
something like that.
Exactly. That was 100% Vernon's argument, is if you that he did not view ESA as being the Experimental Economics Association, and hence hence the original structure with the section heads, rather than now we have the board of directors, or whatever it's called. Executive committee. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for talking to me, Mark. It's really been a pleasure.
Oh, it's pleasure.
To get your insights.
Pleasure to be here and record some of this for posterity. So, good luck to everybody. Thanks a lot.